While the focus is generally on Jacob and Esau with respect to the blessing, there is another character in the narrative who is actually central to the entire dynamic. And part of the reason that the person is often ignored in terms of culpability, in terms of centrality, is because the person is playing the role of what would be considered a psychopath. And so you see some scapegoating going on. You see a golden child dynamic going on. You see the manipulation going on. You see the lack of remorse going on. We will get into it in detail. However, what we are going to focus on is Rhebekka. And so we are using Rhebekka to provide a template of the biblical profile of a psychopath. We are also going to address this issue of identification with the aggressor because there are a number of people, for myriad reasons, that identify with Rhebekka and they sympathize with Rhebekka. They excuse and justify Rhebekka's behaviors. So much so that they will even put the responsibility of Rhebekka's behavior onto the creator, thereby absolving Rhebekka of any wrongdoing, even though Rhebekka announces that she will take the curse onto herself. Of course, you never hear anything about the curse that she has actually received. Before we go into Rhebekka, the identification with the aggressor, and this biblical profile of a psychopath, we are going to look at the image of another individual that serves as the antithesis of a psychopath. And so this would be the anti-Rhebekka. And so as you think about and reflect on this individual and the role that this individual plays, you can start to see the differences between a Rhebekka and someone who would be considered the opposite of such. And so it will give you a better understanding of what is basically normal and what is pathological. Even though the image that we are going to look at is an extreme in the other direction, this person would be more like Jeremiah, the weeping servant, whereas Rhebekka is something quite different. And here we have an individual who is serving as a character that functions as the antithesis of the character of Rhebekka. And so here we have the image of the person known as May Boatwright in the book and the film known as The Secret Life of Bees. Now, in this narrative, the individual known as May Boatwright was not only an individual who had sympathy for other people, feeling for other people, this was a person of extreme empathy. So she felt with individuals. She put herself in their shoes and experienced whatever emotions they would have been experiencing. So she was more similar to what would be considered Jeremiah, that weeping prophet. And so there was an extreme amount of empathy with respect to Jeremiah. And you see that same dynamic with this character of May Boatwright. Now with Rhebekka, again, you see the antithesis of this. And so you see what appears to be a lack of remorse. You see what appears to be extreme manipulation. And you see what appears to be a lack of empathy, let alone sympathy. And so before we go into looking at this Rhebekka profile and how it fits with the profile of psychopathy, we are going to look at the dynamic known as identification with the aggressor. We're going to look at this because you have many individuals who identify with Rhebekka versus identifying with those who have been harmed in that situation. And so we're just going to kind of get a glimpse at what might be going on when individuals identify with those who are aggressors, those who are oppressors. You see this quite often when individuals will justify things like slavery, when people justify abuse of others, or someone taking advantage of someone else. When you see that dynamic, you see what is known as this identification with the aggressor. And so let's take a look at that. So, what is this identification with the aggressor or the oppressor all about? It basically is a psychoanalytic dynamic, and there are unconscious components that are going on with this particular dynamic. And so you have a defensive structure. It's a defense mechanism of sorts where the individual is identifying with, they are connecting with the individual who is understood as the victimizer, the individual who is understood as the one bringing the harm. And so it's often an unconscious empathy, but sometimes it's on a very conscious level. And so with the story of Rhebekka, you will hear identification with Rhebekka coming in the form of justifying what Rhebekka has done, excusing what Rhebekka has done, even to the point of placing the responsibility for Rhebekka's behavior onto what would be considered God or the Creator. And so there are a lot of dynamics that go on with excusing Rhebekka, also with excusing Jacob. However, when you look back at the discussion that we had when we went over the scriptural reference with respect to what took place, that conversation between Jacob and Rhebekka, it's very clear that Rhebekka was the mastermind behind the entire dynamic. And along the way, Jacob is trying to help her to see that this may not be the best idea, and that he even sees it as deceptive. He sees it as curse-worthy. He tries to point out to her that this is not making sense, that he doesn't even look like his brother. They are not that similar. However, Rhebekka comes up with a great plan in order to circumvent this ability for Isaac to positively identify Jacob as Jacob. And so she comes up with this and then orders Jacob to obey her. And so again, she is the mastermind behind this entire dynamic, with this man-child going along with this idea that then gets him into a situation where he basically has to run for his life. And then she is so clever that she comes up with yet another plan in order to deal with the situation that she has originally orchestrated. And subsequent to that, if you are not familiar with this story, when Jacob leaves, Jacob then gets taken advantage of in another situation with respect to Rhebekka's brother. And so there is a family dynamic going on with Rhebekka and her brother of orchestrating these dynamics where people are pretending to be that which they are not. So it's a very interesting family game that apparently comes before Jacob and involves Rhebekka and her brother. And you also see a dynamic like this with Abraham. And so this dynamic of family members pretending to be someone else is a family dynamic in this whole narrative. And so now let's just quickly look at some of the dynamics or the traits of a psychopath, of psychopathy, and look at how Rhebekka manifested these dynamics. And as a quick segue here, we're going to just look at the meaning of Rhebekka's name to put this in context. Now, if your name is Rhebekka, this is not about you. This is about this particular character, but we are going to look at the meaning of the name to put the character in context. And here, when you see the root of this name, Rhebekka, you see that it translates to this idea of to bind or to fasten or to ensnare. And so that's an operative word there. Now we are going to look at this profile of psychopathy to better understand what was going on in terms of Rhebekka's behavior, because you can definitely situate Rhebekka's behavior under this profile, this umbrella here. And so what you have with Rhebekka is definitely this egocentric drive that was going on with her. She was pathologically, repetitively focused on what she wanted. And what she wanted was for Jacob to receive the blessing, the birthright, and she wanted Esau to be disinherited. It's unclear what that is all about because that is not clarified. What you see, however, is that she had a favorite, and she wanted her favorite to come out on top. And this is consistent with what happens in families with parents who do this. And so sometimes you have parents who have favorite children in these types of households, and what will end up happening is that the children will be put on a pedestal. They will be considered and treated as the golden child as long as they behave and obey the commands, as Rhebekka indicated. And the other children may be sort of cast off. Now, when a golden child does not behave, then often, even though they've been put up on a pedestal, they may be taken down and then discarded. And so with Rhebekka's behavior, you also see this lack of morality. She had no sense of what she was doing. She had no sense of it being wrong. Even though she indicated that she would take the curse upon herself, there was no intention indicated that she would be taking this curse upon herself. She apparently planned for this to be a complete deception against both Isaac and Esau. She also manifested, if you recall in the narrative after this situation, she talks about how, she needs her children to marry a certain type of person, a certain class of individual. And so she uses this as the justification for sending Jacob off in order to spare him of Esau's wrath. She had a complete lack of empathy and a cold heart with respect to how this was going to impact Esau. You do not see or hear anything in the narrative about her truly comforting Esau after this entire thing has taken place. She takes no responsibility for what she has done. You do not hear any sense of remorse for what she has done. She feels justified in what she has done. And what she does after this is she continues on with this lying. So the lying becomes pathological. She is pathologically manipulating. So she manipulates the first circumstance, then she goes on to manipulate additional circumstances. According to her narrative, she's trying to spare Jacob. She doesn't want to lose multiple people at one time. This is all about Rhebekka. And the other thing that she does is she's gaslighting Isaac. And so Isaac is not even clear about his own reality. He believes he is hearing Jacob, but Rhebekka has orchestrated it so that when Isaac uses his other senses, he will be deceived. So he will feel what feels like Esau. He will smell what smells like Esau. He will eat food that tastes like Esau made the food. And all of this is orchestrated by Rhebekka in order to have Isaac question his own hold on reality. And as this is all playing out, Rhebekka plays the woe is me character in all of this. And so what you see here is a profile of how psychopathy operates. As a matter of fact, you see quite a bit of these dynamics that are being described right here in many situations that are going on today with the current situation. So you see people engaged in extreme narcissism. You see a lack of morality with respect to the way that things are being handled in the current situation. You see people being positioned to give themselves a superiority complex in relation to others in terms of the current situation. You see a cold-heartedness in terms of the behaviors of some people in relation to other people in the current situation. And you definitely see this pattern of pathological lying, pathological manipulation, and extreme gaslighting. And so this dynamic with Rhebekka is not reserved just for Rhebekka. You see a number of people that play out these parts in real life, and perhaps you know some of these people. And then you have a sufficient number of people who also empathize with these behaviors. And it could be because they have experienced it, they've been on the receiving end of it, and so therefore they are confused about it, and then they excuse it, or they justify it because they identify with it, because this is a part of who they are. So this is normal for them. And so they may normalize this particular profile of behavior. And so we are going to wrap up with a reflection on an earlier discussion that we had with respect to the transatlantic slave trade. In some instances, you have had individuals who have identified with the aggressor or the oppressor with respect to the transatlantic slave trade. And this has resulted in either justifying the slave trade or dismissing the harm from the slave trade, recharacterizing the transatlantic slave trade, saying that it never happened. What has evolved out of all of this is that those individuals are usually understanding themselves as somehow being connected to the slave traders. And so therefore, this is their own identification with the aggressor, with the oppressor. And so therefore, they are justifying these types of behaviors because they feel connected to the perpetrator. And so therefore, they don't see anything wrong with it, and they would like to gaslight other people into seeing this in the same way. So you see this justification. You saw a similar dynamic with respect to the individual Ariobi, talking about the great-grandfather who was a slave trader. You saw this dynamic when some countries in Africa sought to apologize for their country's role, historic role in the transatlantic slave trade. And then you saw the country that is understood as Nigeria taking a different stance with some of the leaders, indicating that at the time slavery was very, very, very legal. And so therefore there was that Rhebekka type of dynamic going on where individuals who had an opportunity to atone for this behavior instead came up with a justification for it. And so you see that among descendants sometimes of slave traders in the Americas, but you also see this dynamic among those who were on the other side of the Atlantic And so you see that shared sense of justification with respect to this particular behavior, in the same way that you see individuals identifying with Rhebekka and Rhebekka's behavior. If you look at Genesis 32 and 33, you will actually get a better idea of Jacob's processing with respect to this entire dynamic. And so you will see that Jacob continued to see his behavior, his part in this entire dynamic as wrong, and he attempted to make amends. And you also see this process of atonement, and you see this process of reconciliation with Jacob and Esau. And so it's unclear about how the conflicts continued on in terms of biblical narratives, because you do see this process of reconciliation. You see Jacob admitting wrong. So you see remorse. So Jacob doesn't, according to the profile, actually fit the profile of psychopathy. Rhebekka, however, does. And you see Esau with what is known as a forgiving spirit in the context of this entire dynamic. And so it's a very interesting psychological profile looking at this entire family. You are encouraged to look at it a little bit more and see if you can see it from a different vantage point to better understand the roles of the people, the morality issues that were embedded in these narratives, and to see if you can see better what might have been a better way to handle this situation, in fact. And blaming God for it is not the way to handle the situation. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.